Today's talk and presentation is stemming from some recent forays I have done into existing forms and presentations on these various philosophical, political, and social aspects. So what I would say to start with is a lot of importance should be drawn from a concept or what you might term a rubric called physiognomy. And physiognomy itself is this interpretation of what things look like in how you determine their soul or their message and their ethos. How they exist is interpreted by us using our faculties, and this is a really strong determinant in how we should treat them, because that's how they act and how their soul is borne out in the way that they look. So typically you can find this in insects, with ones that are not so nice, not looking so nice, and then beautiful ones like butterflies looking quite objectively pretty. So from that sort of starting point, what we can then draw a line toward, and this is the corollary here on how we can think about both a lived philosophy, but also what it means for us to exist and actually become both the soul and person who we are, and let good ideas permeate into ourselves and then react and engage with them in a real way, in a lived way, so that you do become your syncretic philosophy, that you are becoming a better growing importance to both yourself but also to the broader social fabric that you have ingratiated yourself into. So this, like I said, is a bit of a caused presentation from what I've seen recently, and a lot of that has come down to a lot of these dotard academics rambling on about these very important topics and philosophical ideas and political movements in such a banal and uninteresting, unaesthetic way that it really belies the actual power behind ideas and how you can go from a feeling and an idea to an action, which can lead to huge repercussions, greatness even. And that, I think, is a very disappointing reality that we live in now, where you have these uninspired media personalities, journalists, podcasters, what have you, who try to elucidate a powerful philosophy, even more controversial ones like Marxism or Leninism, but where you look at them and you think, okay, but this person is pathetic. They look pathetic. They could never actually be a herald or a harbinger or some sort of important person in any of these movements because of how insipid they are. So I think that's a super important detail when listening or choosing to listen to someone, is whether you feel like, okay, but the person telling me these things is actually taking on a form of the necessarily archetypal figurehead, or what the image is that you're trying to relay from who it is inside that you are and your soul, what it speaks to you and in your blood, outwards towards the rest of us and how we can see and interpret you. And this is done through a lot of things. So it could be anything from hygiene to eating well, to exercising, to how long you spend in an office at a screen at a hunched over, poor posture, things like that. But I think we have traditionally known this, and this is not new to hopefully anybody, but when you start to speak about it, hopefully it becomes a bit more cerebral and you can act a bit more forthrightly and how you would want to. Things like phrenology and eugenics previously have really dealt with this in a visceral form, to say, like, look at these people, this is how negativity can be observed and understood. And maybe phrenology is not, doesn't have that many advocates currently or maybe ever, but in general I think it's coming from a place that we can understand and why it's a pseudoscience, a so-called pseudoscience. We can delve into that after, but I think it's just important to know that this is not a new phenomenon, but rather a recap on what it can be considered if you are new to philosophy or new to ideas, or you are just cruising through YouTube and all these social media platforms and you're bombarded with all these people telling you things. what does that person actually look like, and how that impacts your relation to them from should I listen to this? Are they being earnest and sincere with their beliefs? And what is it that we might actually garner from following this person, even just intellectually, through a journey where you might follow them on social media and understand and interact with them in that way. So I think the most important thinker in this realm is probably Goethe, in terms of both at least aesthetics but also genius and power, and how he understood the relation between how you looked, what you said, the semiotics of what's understood by the signaling effect that you do have, and recognizing people completely as they are, not as is potentially a facade where over time, and you can see this a lot I think in modern society with how much facial configurations, so Botox and filler and surgeries are gone through by a lot of people in terms of they want to look like someone that they aren't, and whether that's aging poorly or it's a nose or it's a chin or a jaw. Otto Weininger, an important philosopher from the previous century, highlighted a lot of these factors in his treatise on masculinity and femininity, sex and character, but in that he identified a lot of the importance on what masculinity means, and then that can be borne out in how a man is masculine or femininity and how a woman is feminine, and in what ways we can understand that, and how on the spectrum of sex do we fully comprehend where someone is both very masculine in that ideal. So because of this, there has been a disconnect between, I think, philosophy and lived life, and that there is a lot of embarrassing communicators, podcasters, YouTubers, where they're fat, disheveled, disgusting, abhorrent, and trying to communicate and articulate beautiful ideas and powerful ideas in ways that we want to reject just because the messenger is so ghastly. And I think that there's definitely a responsibility from someone that if you choose to be aligned, or you think metaphysically around a way that you want to behave and live and act, then it needs to reflect your soul. And if your soul is in a constant battle and you'll never reconcile these thoughts and feelings with what you believe is an ideal, then you'll never truly comprehend what it means to be a warrior, to be a knight, to be a Viking, these very archetypal Faustian ideals, versus just to be a nobody who's not able to live up to anything, and not become this Ubermensch, but necessarily try to be a Superman in the ways that you can. So for me, that's one of the most important axioms around how we understand both the world around us, but exactly what that means in terms of interaction with other people, and potentially how you interact with people communicating to you a lot of these ideas, whether it's second, tertiary, fourth hand information and ideas. It's political commentators on large network news who, via a process of degrading conceptualizations, can come down to a very plebeian level of the same more or less ideas. And that you as yourself may not think this, but if I said the word hero, in your mind there is a conjured conceptual vehicle of something or someone, and how they look is always going to be an ideal version of this, versus if I told you there was a villain. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for instance, is a really good juxtaposition of this, where we go from having someone who looks like an upstanding citizen to a retrograde form of an abomination, and how that can be encapsulated in physiognomy is very clear. I think Ezra Pound probably is also one of those luminaries in this area, where he talks a lot about both the beauty and the precision, but also what first rate to second rate means, and why it's important that we really do take ideals and the communicators of these philosophical ideas and discard kind of these excess and auxiliary ones, in terms of you have a very finite amount of attention and things to listen to, and you should be very considerate with how you do spend your time and what it is spent doing. Now, role models and thought leaders and politicians at the moment obviously carry around a very bureaucratic, I would say, non-distinct and not necessarily ugly, but a plebeian ideal of facelessness. So what a bureaucrat looks like is kind of this grey beige mass of who cares. They're there for a kind of important role. But what happens and what ends up happening is, via democratic and more insidious processes, is that these people come into certain hierarchical levels of power. So you're letting people, by virtue of laziness, slip into these positions of power where their ugliness and their evil attitude and morality will pervade into certain things. And what evilness looks like is, I think, very visceral. We intuit it very well. And the older and more disgusting people come, or the older and more noble and graceful people become, is just more evidence of the integrity and the quality of the character. So what we can then more or less do here, and this is why I've got this presentation up, is to say, here's some evidence, understand it, hopefully it's useful and maybe a little bit enlightening or funny or something like that, but what it can mean to hear words gallant and dictator and communist, and when you conjure these images, why is it that you do? And it's probably very natural for you to understand that this is an important mechanism in your ability to both understand the world and the social stratum around you, and exactly how you perceive yourself and where you want to associate yourself to. So do you want to be a winner or a loser? It can be very much that basic. So here I think it's quite good to, if we potentially just start with what it looks like in a Euhemeristic depiction of the first one being Arminius Hermann, and what he meant to Germany and the formation of the German thought and spirit. And so when we talk Faustian, we talk about inception, and an inception of an idea is where Hermann comes to play, and later Widukind in how we look to our forefathers and forebears in a way that is inspiring and noble, and our progenitor and our even if you go back further to Odin or an Allfather, someone who's got this seamless and transcendent nobility and valor attached to them conceptually, means that anytime they're depicted or painted or written about, is always this reverence and awe, which I think is a super important condition of how we conceptualize ourselves in relation to our forefathers, and also the world around us as it exists, the actual being, and from the becoming to the being. Here we can also see Beowulf and Balder. So these are also these mythos into reality, where we take what is an idea of someone who probably did exist and build around them this aura of either invincibility or courage, or it's necessarily these positive and noble good traits which we say, yes, these people embodied who we think we should be. And Napoleon here depicted quite gallantly, waving his flag, is also a really good example of just pure this is a fictional picture in terms of this event may not have happened exactly like this, but we tend to believe that the nature of the event is less important than what the picture is showing us symbolically. And I think that is very much one of those important distinctions around what truth to fact actually means, and why it's important to there's a distinction between them, that truth is actually a lot of times more important than fact, and that how we understand the world around us can be just done through a truth lens rather than necessarily fact-based, historical. It has to be as written, and that's an audited account of events. That's not how humans live, it's not how we behave, and it's not how we interpret things. It's useful for many things, but it's definitely not the case that philosophically I think it's a reliable source of, yes, you should definitely think Beowulf was only this historical princeling of the Geats in this century, and that's all he did, and the reality of the poem is non-existent, therefore you should not feel any certain way about Beowulf. On the opposite end of this spectrum is obviously what Nietzsche didn't necessarily like to call evil, but I think this insidious development of the darker side of the soul. Here we have a depiction of Mephistopheles, where we understood in the Ballad of Faust that he was the deceiver, whereby he would more or less offer the Faustian bargain as we know it. And then also Loki here, which you could say is maybe the archetypal figure in all of our mythos, and generally how we perceive villainy and deception and all these negative traits that we do hold as someone who is a god of all of these deleterious behaviors would necessarily look and act in a way that's off-putting and disgusting to us, which more or less leads us into how we can perceive lived philosophy. And so looking, and this is more recent philosophy than necessarily older, more genteel philosophy, which was more centered around, say, epistemology or realms of meta-thought, but much more lived philosophies, whereby in the 19th century we did progress philosophy, and I will say progress in this sense, to a point where we can encapsulate beyond what was traditionally the home of a Christian ethos to a point where we would live a philosophy which was not necessarily connected to a religious philosophy. So whether it was scholastic or theosophy or something like that. So here I have more or less put together a collage to kind of give you an idea of what I mean by the strength and weakness of character and how it's born out of the soul, and that necessarily those people who are trying to communicate ideas to us in a way that might seem clever or intellectual, but the actual meaning is either disingenuous or it's deleterious to how we live. And so from this we can, I would say, perceive the character of someone in their philosophy, because these men all lived a certain philosophy, or at least communicate to almost death their philosophy of how they think and believe and live. So obviously the easy ones to see here in Nietzsche, Pound, Carlyle, I think, and I think I've included what you might not call traditional philosophy or philosophers here, because of I think philosophy can also be interpreted out of not necessarily works of non-fiction, but art and literature in general, as well as other things like music. But for me, it's easier to conceptualize. Like, I think if you saw Wagner, you would also come to those same sort of beliefs. But here, looking at Wittgenstein, even Peirce and Klages, and having all distinct and dissimilar philosophies, but yet still ones associated with an inherent goodness, a Faustian striving of let us dominate in a way and understand the world in a way that's pure and with I think good sentiments, positive sentiments. Von Liszt I've included here because of the archetype of the wizard that he kind of encapsulates, and you can see from him that he is this and he was obviously endeavoring to be this noble wizard type. You could maybe think of Gandalf from Lord of the Rings here, but this is a general Wotan Odin perspective. It's a avatar, you might call it, of the way Odin is perceived to us conceptually and how we've understood it from art and literature and other depictions. Whereas on a more, I won't devolve into calling it weak philosophy, but I think it's definitely a negative philosophy in terms of what it's meant from an ugliness perspective, and definitely in terms of a lack of nobility, a lack of being true to oneself, is that these philosophers or intellectual intelligentsia on the right here don't necessarily embody anything that I think is laudable. Very much the opposite, and I think that it is quite easy to see in either the outcomes of their applied philosophy or their lives themselves that these people were not good, honest, earnest people, but in fact they were grifters, or they necessarily were insipid fools or subterfuge, parties to subterfuge, or in some cases brutality in the ignoble sense. So whether that was Lenin, or obviously Zizek here just being ugly, I think, in soul and in necessarily communication, but having to listen to that guy say anything at all is almost impossible for me, just because of how off-putting he is in general. And I do think that bears out in his soul, that his choice of philosophical idols and the way that he interprets Marxism and Lacan and all these disgusting French philosophers is just embodying who he is, in that he aligns himself with the ugliness because he is ugly, and it's easy to take strength from even uglier people and say, look at me in a relative point of view, look how much more noble I am, and how I can actually become a hero in this inverted way of, if you believe in this ugliness as an ideal, then I'm actually one of those messengers who can deliver you what you want to hear and what you want to understand. So I think politically this is also the case when you do take a look at, in the West in particular, any communistic remnants of what you might call the Cold War, where you have a party of 30-year-old men and women who are calling themselves communists. It's always this unaesthetic, disgusting mess of people. And then going even further back, I think you can say egalitarianism, utilitarianism, these sort of ideas of everyone being equal are only propounded by other philosophers or sociologists who are themselves hoping that this is true because of their inability to define and be distinctual in their ability to both gain power, understand why they're unhappy, and also project themselves to the universe. So Russell, I think, is also a good example of this, and Wittgenstein obviously notoriously didn't like Bertrand Russell's philosophy, which maybe is hard to understand when you're new to philosophy, because he talks in a very seemingly positive way and is very negative towards anything that would be deemed a hierarchical deconstruction of a reality, whereby he thinks that there's victims and then there's the oppressors, and that's the mentality which he projects basically upon all of the social history, but also philosophical history. And you can, after maintaining a certain level of research, I would call it maybe, but understanding at least what analytical philosophy is and does, it's quite easy to reject that from a lived standpoint, because his ideals are just nonsensical. They're not dealing with truth, and they're not dealing with human realities of how we as agents act and how we perform. So on the flip side of being, you can still be analytical like Wittgenstein or Peirce with pragmatism, but the way that you go about interacting in a lived way is obviously going to be determined by your soul, and whether you have an ugly or a noble soul will more or less show you this. This, I think, is, once again, I'll reiterate, it's very common in terms of a lot of people have heard of physiognomy, but how they actually allow it to dictate their lives is, I think, one of those social mechanisms whereby we've tried to remove the shame and the ability to what we would call bullying now, in saying, look, you can't be a disgusting, fat, rude, ugly person in ways that you make everyone else feel uncomfortable. We now socially have to accept who you are, and that yes, you're allowed to do whatever you want in a lot of ways. And this sort of freedom of the ego, which Max Stirner in particular was very fond of, what could rule over us, and ideally you would get to a point where nothing would. But I think in misunderstanding what freedom can allow for, most people have just decided to let their lives degrade and not put in work or effort to really refining who they are and exemplifying a positive growth mind, and not even in the really wanky I would call it Sigma male, but that the modern movement of making sure you're always progressing, earning money and doing all these obnoxious things, but just in a much more temporal sense, being who you are and true to yourself, but in a way that's much more aligned with the positive attributes of who you could be and becoming. So we can relate that back to deeper philosophical context, but I don't think it's necessary sometimes to be so intellectual and I think reductive, and definitely overemphasizing the nuances of certain ideas and concepts, because to the public in general, and I think laymen in particular, it is just important to understand these intuitively, and we can come with these messages of, you should clean your room, like Peterson said. But I think for him, his degradation of being, how he's sank to, I would say, lows of his appearance and his messaging communication faculties tells you that for him it was almost a coping strategy of, this is how I wish I was, and I'm going to idealize a certain modus operandi of my life. And then obviously his inability to uphold that has eaten away to a great degree his conscience. And I think that's both I think it's admissible in that he's probably quite high strung, but I think there's a lot of character flaws to someone like that, who had probably what would have been a quite catalyzing message for a lot of particularly young men, in the way that you could reinvent yourself positively into one of maybe a Jungian archetype, as he loves to talk about so much, whether it's a hero or a warrior or a wizard or some sort of positive visage. But here we're dealing now with what we can consider almost lunacy, and at some point I'm sure he'll be institutionalized again, which once again speaks into physiognomy as a super powerful concept, that we can see this real-time degradation of someone, decay, that leads, I guess, to a conclusion here, and shown below, that there is a lot of classical thought, particularly in the early 20th century, around how we consider someone, particularly their face, but also now their body and the way that they dress and their hygiene and the things that they do, all in these terms of a lived philosophy. And if you haven't considered it and you haven't actively lived a philosophy, then you still have an intuited philosophy from your soul speaking to you in terms of, I want to look good or I don't care. I want to achieve great grades at school or I don't care. And all these reflections are of you as a person. So you need to very much harness and maybe even speak to, but also try and transform all these negative aspects into some archetypal idealized goal, and making sure that you are going to not turn out like a lot of these negative and I want to say left-leaning, but in terms of an ugliness spectrum, you want to err on the side of, I would consider, the aesthetic side, and that for everyone is possible. So even if you start from, I wasn't born handsome, I wasn't born smart, I wasn't born athletic, all these things are mediated in ways that you can go and say, look, it's not necessarily moot to go out and consider ways that you can improve yourself, first philosophically and metaphysically, but then also physically, and as you start becoming both who you are but also the archetype of yourself, and really trying to, and this is Nietzsche's, I think, underlying philosophy here, is to be that Superman. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be better than everyone else in everything. It's being this unobtainable version of yourself that you can reflect on and say, look at how impressive I was and what I was able to overcome and achieve through this suffering, and now that's made me into this avatar of whoever it might be, that I think you can track it back philosophically but also mythologically. So am I now the avatar of Thor, of Freya, of Heimdall? What kind of personality is encapsulated by these Faustian ideals that have been laid down to us by our forefathers? So I think that's just one of those really important ones to say, and if you can bully YouTubers or podcasters or communicators with this message, you definitely should. I think if they're going to be out there in your face with their ugliness, they need to know that it's a reprehensible thing to have to force upon a populace, and certain platforms need to think about how we can more meaningfully detract from their messages. And I think that's one of those missions that's always going to be more noble than it is ignoble.